Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Bob Long. If you're watching these videos, you know they're intended for use by my students in my courses. If you stumbled across these on YouTube and find them helpful, great, use them. Please learn the material that your instructor wants you to know. These are designed for my students. Anyone who finds these videos helpful, hit like and subscribe. That helps me out and increases my ability to help you guys out in the future. Now today's video is one of our laboratory videos. We're going to start going over the bones of the skeleton. If you're in my class, that's for lab tests too. Now, a lot of students think this is one of the hardest lab tests because the list of structures that you have to know is extremely long. There's a lot of structures on the skeletal system that you must know. We're going to trim it down to the ones that we think that our students need to know. We may leave some off that other classes find important. We might include some. So, make sure that you follow the list of structures that you're responsible for. Now, before I get into that, you can see we have a plastic skeleton here. I want to talk a little bit about the skeleton in and of itself. One of the things that you need to know is that when we talk about our skeleton, the entire human skeleton is 206 bones for the average human being. Now, some people have a couple of bones that might be fused together, might have a few fewer bones. Some people are born with some bones that did not fuse, so they have a few extra. But on average, we have 206 bones. Now, the skeleton is divided into two regions. There's what we call the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton gets its name from the word axis. Just like the earth rotates on its axis, this is the center line of the skeletal system right down the middle here. You should know which structures are found in the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton includes the skull, which the skull itself is up to about 30 bones, okay? Now, when we look at the skull, I actually think it's about 28 to 30 bones. I lose count, but we have 8 cranial bones. The cranium is the brain case. We have 14 facial bones, that's 22. And then we have 6 auditory ossicles. Okay, so that's 28 bones that make up the human skull. We're not going to cover the auditory ossicles here. But essentially, the skull itself is all of the structures associated with the skull here. Now, when we look at the next part, if I turn Flacco here around, we have the vertebrae of the spine. There are 33 vertebrae that you need to know, and we'll cover that later on. But they are part of the axial skeleton. Attached to the vertebrae are 12 pairs of ribs, 12 on the right, 12 on the left, and the ribs are connected anteriorly to this structure called the sternum. So it includes the ribs, it includes the sternum. The last structure that we include with the axial skeleton is right up underneath the mandible. There's a small bone that's shaped similar to the mandible that sits in the throat called the hyoid bone. We'll be taking a look at it as well. So those are the bones of the axial skeleton. Everything else on the skull is referred to as the appendicular skeleton. Now the appendicular skeleton gets its name from the word appendix, which means an add-on or an appendage. And it includes our 4 appendages or limbs, the 2 arms and the 2 legs. So it includes arms and hands, the legs and feet. But there's 2 other major structures that are associated with the appendicular skeleton. There are 2 bones here, your collarbone and your shoulder blade, really called the clavicle and the scapula, which attach the arm to the axial skeleton. They are part of the appendicular. So we call the 4 bones, we have a collarbone or clavicle on either side, and a scapula posteriorly on either side, and they make a little girdle or ring around the axial skeleton that attaches the upper limbs. So we call that the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle is simply the 2 clavicles and the 2 scapulae. And what attaches the legs to the axial skeleton is what we call the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is made up of 6 separate bones, and we'll be covering it in detail. There's 2 bones called the os coxae, but each one of those bones is made up of 3 smaller bones that fuse together into a larger one. So when we talk about the axial skeleton, We simply mean these structures right down the midline: skull, vertebrae, sternum and ribs, and the hyoid bone. The appendicular skeleton would be the arms and hands, the legs and feet, the pectoral girdle, and the pelvic girdle. Okay, so that's sort of a general introduction. There's different shapes of bones: long bones, short bones, flat bones. We're going to cover some of that in lecture. What I'm going to do in the next video is I'm going to go over the structures of the skull with some projected images, and then we'll actually do another video where we see those structures on the skull on an actual skull model. We have pictures of all of these models online for you guys to study, and those will be the pictures we use for the lab test. So I hope you had some fun. I hope you enjoyed watching this. I hope you learned something. I'll see you in the next video where we start covering these structures.